year was 49 BCE, and the air in the Siwa oasis was a soft, warm breeze that smelled of ripening dates, the cool water of the spring, and the dry, ancient dust of the surrounding desert. Bayek of Siwa, a man whose skin was the color of the sun-baked earth, stood on the high ridge overlooking the temple of Amun. He was a mage, a protector of the people, but the air around him was heavy with a sorrow that no title could ease. A year had passed since the tragedy that had torn his life apart, and the air in his lungs felt like lead. Beside him, his eagle Senu circled in the rising thermals, the air under her wings carrying the scent of the coming heat. Bayek adjusted the leather strap of his shield, the air silent except for the distant, rhythmic chanting of the priests in the valley below. The tragedy began in the shadows of the temple, where the air was stagnant and smelled of old incense and the cold stone of the crypts. A group of masked men, known only as the Order of the Ancients, had seized Bayek and his young son, Kemu. The air in the underground chamber was thick with the scent of burning oil, and the metallic tang of the knife they held to the boy's throat. They demanded that Bayek use an ancient, glowing sphere to open a vault of the gods. The air around the sphere vibrated with a low, humming power that made the dust motes dance in the dark. In the struggle that followed, the knife meant for Bayek found his son instead. The air was suddenly filled with a cry that would haunt Bayek's dreams forever. A sound that transformed the protector into a seeker of vengeance. Now Bayek hunted the men responsible, his path leading him back to Siwa to confront the local priest, Mejinamun, a man whose soul was as dry as the desert sand. The air in the village was thick with fear, smelling of the smoke from the cooking fires and the sweat of people who had been forced into labor to build the priest's monuments. Bayek moved through the streets like a shadow, the air barely stirred by his presence. He saw the way the guards treated the elders, the air ringing with the sound of their heavy wooden staves. He felt the weight of his duty returning, a realization that his personal quest was tied to the suffering of all Egypt. The air in Siwa was ripe for a change, and Bayek was the storm that would bring it. He infiltrated the temple of Amun under the cover of a moonless night, the air cool and carrying the scent of the desert lilies. He moved along the high stone walls, his fingers finding grip in the ancient carvings of the gods. Inside the inner sanctum, the air was still and smelled of the heavy perfumes used to mask the corruption of the priest. Mejinamun sat by a pool of water, the air around him vibrating with the energy of the same glowing sphere that had cost Bayek his son. The priest was trying to decipher the secrets of the ancients, his breath shallow and greedy in the quiet of the temple. Bayek dropped from the rafters, the air whistling past his ears as he landed with a silent, heavy finality. The struggle was brief, but intense. Mejinamun fought with the desperation of a man who saw his stolen power slipping away, the air in the sanctum filled with the clatter of his bronze ornaments against the stone floor. Bayek used the priest's own hubris against him, his movements a fluid response to the man's frantic strikes. The air was suddenly hot and dry as the sphere pulsed with a final, dying light. Bayek delivered the final blow, not with a blade, but with the very relic the priest had coveted. As Mejunamun died, the air in the chamber grew cold, and for a moment, Bayek saw a vision of the Jewett, where the air was a soft, eternal mist. He had taken his first step on the path of the hidden ones. He emerged from the temple as the first light of dawn touched the tops of the palm trees, the air turning a pale, shimmering gold. The people of Siwa gathered in the courtyard, the air filling with a cautious, growing hope. Bayek stood before them, the air around him still and respectful. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He was a Medjay once more, a shield for those who had none. He told them that the priest was gone, and the air in the oasis felt lighter, the heavy scent of fear replaced by the fresh smell of the morning water. He knew his journey was just beginning, and that Egypt was a land of many shadows that needed to be cleared. Bayek prepared to leave Siwa, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the great pyramids lay hidden in the haze of the desert. The air was hot and carried the scent of the dry grass and the distant salt of the sea. He met with his wife, Aya, in the ruins of their old home, the air there smelling of the desert dust and the memory of their lost happiness. Aya was a woman of sharp intellect and fierce loyalty, her spirit as restless as the wind. The air between them was a mixture of deep love and a shared, unwavering purpose. She had been in Alexandria, tracking the higher members of the order, and the air of the city she described was one of intrigue and the smell of the papyrus scrolls of the great library. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the air turning a deep purple, Bayek looked at the stars. He realized that the order was not just a group of men, but a poison that was spreading through the very air of Egypt. To stop them, he would have to become something more than a Medjay. He would have to move in the shadows, his presence a secret that only the guilty would ever know. The air was full of the sound of the desert wind, a constant, rhythmic reminder of the vastness of the task ahead. They made a pact to hunt every member of the order, the air between them, a silent vow that would change the course of history. The journey toward Alexandria was a long trek across the shifting sands, the air during the day, a shimmering heat that made the horizon dance. Bayek traveled with Senu. The eagles cries a sharp, clear note in the silence of the dunes. The air at night was cold and carried the scent of the dry shrubs and the ancient stone of the tombs. He encountered travelers and merchants, the air in their camps smelling of roasted meat and the smoke of the dung fires. He listened to their stories of the young Queen Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy, the air of the country vibrating with the tension of a civil war. Bayek knew that the order was fueling this conflict, feeding on the chaos to secure their control. The first part of his journey ended as the towers of Alexandria appeared in the distance, the air turning cool and smelling of the Mediterranean Sea. The city was a forest of white marble and gold, its air filled with the sound of 1,000 voices and the rhythmic thud of the ships against the stone docks. Bayek took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt and the promise of a new battlefield. He was the protector of Egypt, and the shadows of the city were waiting for him. The sun set over the water, the air glowing with a final, fiery red, as the Medjay stepped into the heart of the world. The air in Alexandria was a sharp contrast to the quiet sands of Siwa, smelling of salt spray, expensive cedar oil, and the dry, sweet scent of thousands of papyrus scrolls. It was a city of white marble that seemed to glow against the deep blue of the Mediterranean Sea. Bayek moved through the crowded markets near the great library, the air filled with the shouting of merchants in a dozen languages and the rhythmic clatter of chariot wheels on the stone streets. He felt out of place in his simple leather armor, the air of the city feeling heavy with the complexities of Greek and Roman politics. He was there to find Aya, but the air around him was thick with the presence of the royal guards of Ptolemy, their bronze armor reflecting the harsh Egyptian sun. He found Aya in a secret hideout near the docks, the air inside smelling of the sea, old wood, and the iron scent of the blades she was sharpening. The reunion was a brief moment of warmth in a world that had turned cold. The air between them was silent as they shared the information they had gathered. Aya had been working with the exiled Queen Cleopatra, a woman whose ambition was as vast as the desert itself. The air in the city was vibrating with the news of a coming civil war between the queen and her brother, Ptolemy. Aya told Bayek that the order of the ancients was the power behind the boy king's throne, and that a member known as the Snake was draining the life from the city's heart. Bayek's hunt for the snake led him to the royal palace, where the air was stagnant and smelled of heavy perfumes and the still water of the decorative pools. He moved through the gardens under the cover of a humid night, the air filled with the chirping of insects and the distant, rhythmic footsteps of the guards. He discovered that the snake was a high-ranking official who used his position to fund the order's activities. The air in the man's private study was thick with the scent of wine, and the dry, dusty smell of the ledgers that recorded the misery of the Egyptian people. Bayek struck from the shadows, his hidden blade finding its mark in the silence. As the man died, he spoke of a grand design that the Medjay could never understand, his voice a fatting rasp in the still air. While Bayek cleared the palace, Aya led him to a meeting with Cleopatra herself on the outskirts of the city. The air in the queen's tent was cool and smelled of lotus flowers and the fine silk of the tapestries. Cleopatra was a woman of magnetic power, and the air around her felt charged with the energy of her conviction. She gave Bayek a new weapon, a hidden blade of ancient design, the air clicking as the mechanism locked into place. She tasked him with finding the other members of the order who controlled the flow of grain and gold. The air in the tent was heavy with the weight of the alliance they were forming. Bayek didn't trust the queen, but he knew that the air of Egypt would never be clear until the order was dismantled. Bayek traveled toward the Fayum oasis, where the air was a mixture of the damp scent of the lake and the dry heat of the surrounding hills. This was a land of beauty and brutality, where the Greek settlers lived in luxury, while the Egyptian workers suffered in the fields. The air in the villages was thick with the smell of smoke and the iron scent of the blood spilled by the local militia. Bayek found that the order had a firm grip on the local administration. The air around the villas was filled with the sound of the wind through the papyrus reeds and the distant, low grunts of the hippos in the water. Bayek realized that the man he was hunting was using the local bathhouse as his seat of power, a place where the air was always thick with steam and secrets. The infiltration of the bathhouse was a mission of heat and shadows. The air inside was a suffocating soup of white steam that smelled of eucalyptus and wood smoke. Bayek moved through the private chambers, his skin damp and the air in his lungs heavy. He found his target in a secluded pool, the air there still and echoing with the sound of dripping water. The confrontation was swift. Bayek used the steam to hide his approach, his hidden blade ending the man's control over the region. As the target died, he warned Bayek that the order was not a group of men, but a system that would never die. The air in the bathhouse felt cold as the steam began to clear, leaving Bayek with a growing sense of unease. He returned to the surface, the air of the Fayum feeling fresh and clean after the stifling heat of the baths. He met with a young girl whose father had been murdered by the order, the air between them filled with a quiet, shared grief. Bayek realized that his quest for vengeance was becoming a duty to protect those who had been left behind by the great powers of the world. He spent several days helping the local rebels disrupt the grain shipments, the air of the district filling with the sound of his bronze sword against the shields of the guards. He was becoming a legend in the oasis, a shadow that brought hope to the fields. The air was full of the smell of the harvest and the distant, cooling breeze of the coming evening. I had joined him in the Fayum, her presence a steadying force in the chaos. They sat on the shore of Lake Moeris, the air smelling of the water and the dry grass. She told him that the order was regrouping in Memphis, the ancient capital of the pharaohs. The air there was said to be cursed, a heavy fog of sickness and fear that the locals believed was a punishment from the gods. Bayek knew that the curse was likely the work of the order, a way to keep the people compliant. The air between them was silent and focused as they prepared for the journey. They were no longer just a husband and wife. They were the hidden ones, the protectors of a land that was being torn apart by the greed of men. The journey toward Memphis was a trek through the heart of the Nile Valley. The air during the day, a shimmering heat that made the river look like a ribbon of silver. They traveled by boat, the air filled with the rhythmic splashing of the oars and the cries of the water birds. The air at night was cold and carried the scent of the river mud and the incense from the temples that lined the banks. Bayek watched the shadows of the palms against the moon, the air filling his lungs with a quiet strength. He knew that the fight for Memphis would be a battle against a darkness that had its roots in the very stones of the ancient world. The second part of their journey ended as the towering statues of Memphis appeared on the horizon, the air turning heavy and smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. The city was a place of giant monuments and narrow, winding streets, its air filled with a palpable sense of dread. Bayek took a deep breath, the air tasting of the ancient dust and the mysteries of the past. He was the Medjay of Egypt, and the shadows of Memphis were waiting for him. The sun set behind the pyramids, the air glowing with a final, deep purple, as the hidden ones prepared to enter the heart of the darkness. The air in Memphis was a heavy, stagnant fog that smelled of wet earth, rotting river reeds, and the sharp, chemical scent of the mummification salts. This was the ancient heart of Egypt, a city of towering statues and crumbling stone, where the shadows felt deeper and colder than the desert night. A strange sickness had settled over the streets, the air filling with the sound of labored breathing and the low, rhythmic chanting of priests trying to ward off a curse. Bayek and Aya moved through the city like ghosts, the air around them thick with a sense of impending doom. They discovered that the source of the misery was a member of the order known as the Lizard, a man who was poisoning the very breath of the city by burning toxic incense in the great temple of Ptah. Bayek's investigation led him to the inner sanctum of the temple, where the air was a suffocating yellow haze that stung his eyes and made his throat burn. The Lizard was a priest who used his holy status to hide his crimes, the air in his private chambers smelling of the bitter herbs. He used to weaken the local Apis bull, a sacred symbol of Egypt's strength. Bayek moved through the high, painted columns, the air silent except for the crackling of the braziers. He found the priest performing a dark ritual, the air around the man vibrating with the energy of a precursor artifact. Bayek struck from the smoke, his hidden blade ending the poisoner's life. As the Lizard died, the air in the temple seemed to clear, the heavy scent of the toxins replaced by the cool, fresh breeze from the Nile. While Memphis began to heal, Bayek turned his attention to the surrounding districts, where the order's influence had left the land scorched and the people broken. The air in the fields was thick with the smell of charred grain and the dry dust of abandoned farms. He met with a group of local healers who were trying to treat those affected by the Lizard's poison. The air in their small clinic was warm and smelled of honey, crushed garlic, and the cooling scent of aloe. Bayek spent time gathering the ingredients they needed, the air in the marshes humming with the sound of insects and the splashing of water as he navigated the reed beds. He realized that the order was not just killing individuals, they were destroying the foundation of Egyptian life. The hunt for the next member of the order, a man known as the Hyena, led Bayek to the Great Pyramids of Giza. The air in the desert was a dry, searing heat that carried the scent of sun-baked limestone and the ancient dust of the kings. The hyena was a woman named Khaliset, who had been driven mad by the death of her daughter. The air around her camp near the Sphinx was filled with the sound of the wind through the stone crevices and the rhythmic chanting of the bandits she commanded. Bayek entered the narrow, dark passages of the Great Pyramid, the air inside cold and smelling of the absolute stillness of 4,000 years. He moved through the grand gallery, the air in his lungs feeling thin and ancient. He found Khaliset in a chamber deep beneath the stone, where the air was thick with the scent of old linen and the metallic tang of the precursor machines she was trying to activate. She believed that the ancient technology could bring her daughter back from the Jewett. The air in the room vibrated with a low, blue light that made the shadows dance on the walls. The confrontation was a desperate struggle in the dark, the air ringing with the sound of her bow and Bayek's bronze shield. He eventually cornered her, the air suddenly quiet as she realized her efforts were in vain. As she died, she spoke of the loneliness of the desert, her voice a fading rasp in the silence of the pyramid. Bayek emerged from the pyramid as a sandstorm began to roll in from the west. The air turned a thick, gritty orange, smelling of the deep desert and the electric charge of the wind. He sought shelter in a nearby tomb, the air inside smelling of dry bone and the oil of the ancient lamps. As he waited for the storm to pass, he reflected on the cost of the Order's ambitions. The air in the tomb was still and heavy, a reminder of the many lives that had been sacrificed to the greed of a few. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, the air in his chest filling with a cold, steady resolve. He was no longer just a father seeking revenge. He was the guardian of a civilization's memory. Aya remained in the north, her focus on the shifting alliances of the Mediterranean. She sent word to Bayek of a massive fleet gathering near the coast, the air of the message smelling of the salt, and the ink used to record the movements of the Roman legions. The air in Egypt was becoming more volatile as the power struggle between Cleopatra and Ptolemy reached a breaking point. Bayek knew that he had to strike at the heart of the Order's military strength before they could tip the balance of the war. He traveled toward the fortress of the Crocodile, a member who controlled the Fayum with a ruthless military grip. The air on the road was thick with the smell of horse sweat and the iron scent of the soldier's armor. The Crocodile was a woman named Berenike, who used a massive estate near the water to coordinate her activities. The air around the estate was a mixture of the damp scent of the lake and the smell of roasting meat from her kitchens. Bayek infiltrated the grounds during a lavish banquet, the air inside filled with the sound of music and the laughter of the Greek elite. He moved through the shadows of the pergolas, the air smelling of jasmine and the expensive wine of the guests. He found Berenike in a secluded garden, the air there still and smelling of the damp grass. He delivered justice for the children she had murdered, the air of the garden suddenly cold as her influence over the Fayum was broken. He met with Aya once more in a quiet cove near Alexandria, the air smelling of the sea and the wood fire they built to keep the night chill away. They sat by the water, the air filled with the rhythmic splashing of the waves. Aya told him that the final members of the order were entrenched in the royal court, and that the air of the palace was thick with their secrets. They realized that their individual battles were leading them toward a single, final conflict. The air between them was a mixture of deep love and a shared, unwavering purpose. They made a pact to finish what they had started, the air of the night feeling charged with the weight of the history they were writing. As the sun began to rise over the Mediterranean, the air turning a pale, shimmering gold, Bayek prepared for the journey to the royal city. He was the Medjay of Egypt, and the shadows of the palace were waiting for him. The air was full of the sound of the gulls and the distant, rhythmic thud of the ship's oars. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt and the promise of the coming battle. He was ready to face the masters of the order, his hidden blade a silent end to their reign. The sun touched the white marble of the city, and the hidden ones moved toward the light. The air in Alexandria had turned into a frantic, electric heat, smelling of the Mediterranean salt, the ozone of a gathering storm, and the heavy scent of the cedar oil used on the hulls of the massive Roman fleet. Julius Caesar had arrived, and the air of the city was thick with the tension of two empires meeting on the edge of a blade. Bayek and Aya moved through the streets as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turning a deep, bruised purple. They were tasked with smuggling Cleopatra into the royal palace to meet Caesar, a plan that felt as fragile as the air before a lightning strike. Bayek carried the queen hidden within a large, heavy rug, the air inside smelling of wool, dust, and the sharp, nervous breath of the woman who would be pharaoh. The infiltration of the palace was a mission of absolute silence. The air in the grand hallways was stagnant and smelled of the burning oil from the wall sconces and the cold, metallic scent of the Roman legionnaires' iron armor. Bayek moved through the shadows of the marble pillars, the air barely stirred by his presence. He reached the inner chambers of the palace, where the air was warmer and smelled of expensive frankincense, and the dry, papery scent of the scrolls strewn across Caesar's desk. As the rug was unrolled, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Cleopatra stood before the Roman general, and the air between them became a dense, magnetic force of shared ambition. Bayek stood back, the air in his lungs feeling heavy with the realization that he was witnessing the birth of a new world order. While the political winds shifted, Bayek set his sights on the member of the order known as the Scorpion, a man who served as the commander of the royal guard. The air in the guard barracks was thick with the smell of horse sweat, leather, and the iron scent of the sharpening stones. Bayek moved through the camp like a desert wind, the air whistling through the tent flaps as he neutralized the sentries. He found the Scorpion in a central pavilion, the air there filled with the smell of roasting lamb and the heavy, fermented scent of the wine the officers were drinking. The struggle was quick and brutal, the air ringing with the sound of a short sword against a wooden shield. Bayek's hidden blade ended the commander's life, the air of the pavilion suddenly quiet and cold. As the scorpion died, a massive fire broke out in the harbor, the air quickly filling with the suffocating smell of burning pitch and the black soot of the Egyptian fleet. The great Pharaoh's lighthouse cast a flickering, orange light over the city, the air vibrating with the roar of the flames. Bayek and Aya fought their way through the burning docks to secure a path for Caesar's men. The air was hot and dry, making every breath a struggle against the smoke. They moved through the chaos, the air ringing with the shouts of the dying and the rhythmic crashing of the falling masts. It was in this heat that Bayek realized the library of Alexandria was in danger. The air around the ancient building already turning gray with the ash of the world's knowledge. Bayek raced toward the library, the air becoming a thick soup of smoke and flying embers. He saw the scrolls turning to black flakes in the heat, the air smelling of the ink and the ancient wisdom that was being lost forever. He managed to save a small chest of documents, the air in his lungs burning as he escaped the collapsing roof. He found Aya near the entrance, her face streaked with soot, and the air around her smelling of the salt from the sea. They stood together as the great library burned, the air silent and heavy with the weight of the loss. They knew that the order cared nothing for history or knowledge, only for the power that remained when everything else was gone. The battle for Alexandria shifted to the open sea as the Roman fleet engaged the remnants of Ptolemy's forces. The air on the deck of the ship was wild with the wind, smelling of the salt spray and the blood that slicked the wooden planks. Bayek manned a ballista, the air thrumming with the release of the massive bolts. He watched as the royal barge, carrying the young King Ptolemy, was engulfed by the waves. The air was filled with a final, desperate cry that was quickly swallowed by the roar of the ocean. The civil war was over, but the air of victory felt hollow and cold to Bayek. He saw Cleopatra take the throne, the air of the coronation smelling of lotus and gold, but her eyes were fixed on Rome, not on the people of Egypt. Bayek and Aya met in the quiet of the morning after the coronation, the air turning a pale, shimmering gold. They stood on a balcony overlooking the city, the air fresh and smelling of the morning mist. They realized that their work was far from over. The order had simply changed its shape, hiding behind the power of the new queen and her Roman allies. The air between them was a thick, heavy silence. They knew that to protect the world, they would have to move into the deepest shadows, far beyond the reach of any throne. They made a plan to hunt the last of the men who had been in the crypt at Siwa, the air of the balcony feeling charged with the weight of the path they were choosing. They traveled toward the ancient ruins of the Nile Delta, where the air was damp and smelled of the dark mud and the decaying vegetation. This was a land of hidden canals and forgotten temples, the air filled with the buzzing of insects and the distant, rhythmic splashing of the water. They were hunting the member of the order known as the Vulture, a man who lived among the ruins like a scavenger. Bayek moved through the tall reeds, the air barely stirred by his footsteps. He found the Vulture in a half-submerged temple, the air inside smelling of the stagnant water and the old stone. The confrontation was a silent affair, the hidden blade finding its mark before the man could even cry out. As the sun set over the delta, the air turned a deep, bruised orange, the reflection in the water a ribbon of fire. Bayek and Aya sat together by a small campfire, the air smelling of the wood smoke and the dry grass. They talked of the future, the air filled with the quiet, steady rhythm of the night. They were becoming the architects of a secret world, a brotherhood that would endure long after the names of the kings were forgotten. The air of Egypt was still and expectant, as if the land itself was waiting for the new protectors to take their place. Bayek felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since the day in the crypt, the air in his chest finally feeling light and clear. The fourth part of their journey ended as they prepared to return to the heart of the country. The air was full of the sound of the wind through the palms and the distant, mournful cry of an owl. They were the hidden ones, and the world was beginning to change around them. Bayek took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt of the sea and the dust of the desert. He was ready for the next move, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the ancient capital of Memphis waited in the haze. The sun disappeared behind the dunes, and the shadows took their place in the history of the world. The air in Memphis had not yet fully recovered from the lizard's poison, and it still carried a faint, lingering scent of stagnant water and the sharp, metallic tang of the mummification salts. Bayek returned to the ancient capital with a heart that felt as heavy as the granite statues that lined the processional ways. He had learned that the man who held the knife in the crypt, the one who had directly ended Kemu's life, was still at large, hiding behind the mask of a high-ranking official. The air in the city was thick with the sound of the wind whistling through the hollow eyes of the monuments and the rhythmic, hollow thud of the priests' wooden sandals on the stone floors. Bayek moved through the narrow alleys, the air smelling of the charcoal from the street vendors and the dry, ancient dust that seemed to coat every surface. His investigation led him to a secret archive hidden deep within the foundations of the Temple of Ptah. The air in the lower vaults was cold and still, smelling of the dry papyrus of centuries-old records and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax. Bayek used a small oil lamp to light his way, the flame flickering in the stagnant air. He found a ledger that detailed the private expenditures of the royal court, and a name began to surface in the margins: Flavius Metellus, a Roman proconsul who was a close advisor to Julius Caesar. The air in the vault suddenly felt thinner, as if the realization itself had sucked the life from the room. Flavius was the lion, the the true leader of the Order's operations in Egypt, and the one who had orchestrated the events in the Siwa crypt. Bayek's path to Flavius was blocked by the man's personal protector, a member of the Order known as the Jackal, who had taken over the military garrison in the city. The air in the garrison was thick with the smell of horse sweat, oiled leather, and the iron scent of the sharpening stones used on the Roman gladius. Bayek infiltrated the camp under the cover of a moonless night, the air cool, and carrying the scent of the desert lilies from the nearby gardens. He moved with a brutal, focused efficiency. The air barely stirred as he neutralized the sentries. He found the Jackal in a central tent, the air inside smelling of heavy wine and the smoke from a small bronze brazier. The struggle was short and violent, the air ringing with the sound of a bronze khopesh against a steel breastplate. The Jackal was a man of cold, disciplined violence, and the air in the tent became hot from the friction of their movement. Bayek delivered a final, decisive strike with his hidden blade, the air of the pavilion suddenly quiet. As the man died, he spoke of the inevitability of the Roman order, his voice a fatting rasp in the still air. Bayek stood over him, the air around him smelling of the wine and the copper scent of blood. He had removed the lion's sword, but the lion himself was still in Alexandria, protected by the very air of the Roman presence. Bayek felt a surge of cold fury, the air in his chest feeling like a gathering storm. He knew he had to return to the north, but first, he had to ensure that Memphis was truly free of the Order's shadow. While Bayek dealt with the garrison, Aya was in the great library of Alexandria, searching for the final clues about the precursor vault the lion sought. The air in the library was still and smelled of the charred wood from the recent fire, and the dry, papery scent of the scrolls that had survived. She discovered a map that pointed toward the Cyrenaica region, a place where the air was said to be fresh and carry the scent of the silphium plant. She realized that Flavius was not just a politician. He was a seeker of ancient power who intended to use a precursor artifact to subjugate the minds of the entire province. The air in the library felt heavy with the weight of the secret she now held, a burden that she knew she had to share with Bayek. The twins met on the road to the north, the air smelling of the river mud and the dry grass of the delta. They sat together under the shade of a large sycamore tree, the air filled with the quiet, rhythmic sound of the Nile's current. Aya told Bayek of Flavius and the danger in Cyrene. The air between them was a thick, heavy silence. They realized that their individual battles were leading them toward a final, global conflict. The air of Egypt was full of the sound of the wind, a constant reminder that their time in their homeland was drawing to a close. They made a plan to travel to the western mountains, the air of the path ahead feeling cold and sharp with the promise of the coming snows. The journey toward Cyrenaica was a trek through the high plateaus, where the air was crisp and smelled of the wild herbs and the distant salt of the sea. They traveled with a group of nomadic traders, the air in their camp at night smelling of roasted goat and the smoke of the juniper fires. Bayek listened to their songs of the ancient kings, the air of the mountains vibrating with the history of the land. He felt a sense of peace returning to him, the air in his lungs finally feeling clear after the suffocating atmosphere of Memphis. He knew that the fight for Cyrene would be the most difficult yet, a battle against a man who held the power of Rome in one hand and the power of the gods in the other. As they reached the outskirts of Cyrene, the air turned cool and carried the sweet, sharp scent of the Silphium fields. The city was a place of Greek temples and Roman villas, its air filled with the sound of the lyre and the rhythmic chanting of the students in the gymnasiums. But beneath the elegance, the air was thick with the same fear they had seen in Alexandria. Flavius had already arrived, and the air of the city was vibrating with the energy of the precursor artifact he carried. Bayek took a deep breath, the air tasting of the salt and the ancient stone. He was the Medjay of Egypt, and the lion of Rome was finally within his reach. The night ended with Bayek and Aya standing on a cliff overlooking the city, the air cold and carrying the salt of the Mediterranean. They watched the lights of the Roman camp flicker in the dark, the air between them silent and focused. They were the hidden ones, and the world was beginning to notice the shadows they cast. Bayek checked his equipment, the air in the night still and expectant. He was ready for the final hunt, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the Roman proconsul's palace. The sun set over the water, the air glowing with a final deep red, as the hidden ones prepared to enter the heart of the Roman power. The morning brought a pale, watery sun that struggled to break through the mist of the mountains. The air was crisp and smelled of the sea. Bayek and Aya stood on the ridge, watching the city wake up. They knew that the fight for Cyrenaica was just a chapter in a much larger story. The air was full of the sound of the distant gulls, a constant, rhythmic reminder of their mission. They checked their hidden blades, the air in the small camp still and focused. They were ready for whatever Flavius Metellus and the order of the ancients had waiting for them in the halls of the province. The air in Cyrene was sharp and carried the sweet, herbal scent of the Silphium plant mixed with the cold salt of the Mediterranean. It was a city of towering white columns and steep green hills, but the atmosphere was thick with an unnatural pressure. Bayek moved through the shadows of the Greek gymnasiums, his skin prickling as the air began to vibrate with a low, humming frequency. He learned that Flavius Metellus had retreated into the Acropolis, and the air around the ancient fortress was now a shimmering haze of blue light. The Roman proconsul was no longer just a man. He had activated the apple of Eden, and the air of the city was being reshaped by the will of a god. People in the streets stood frozen or moved in trances, the air in their lungs seemingly stolen by the artifact's power. Bayek reached the gates of the Acropolis under a leaden sky, the air feeling heavy as if a physical weight were pressing down on his shoulders. He moved past the Roman guards, who stood like statues, their eyes blank and their breath shallow in the stagnant air. As he entered the main hall, the air was suddenly split by a flash of golden light that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. Flavius stood at the far end of the chamber, the apple glowing in his hand like a trapped sun. The air around the Roman was a chaotic swirl of energy that distorted the very space between them. Bayek felt the weight of his grief and his son's memory pull at his mind, the air in the room echoing with the whispers of the dead. A psychological weapon crafted by the precursor device. The confrontation was a battle of reality against illusion. Flavius used the apple to create duplicates of himself, the air in the hall filling with a dozen versions of the lion, each moving with a flickering, ghostly speed. Bayek had to trust his instincts rather than his eyes, the air around him cold, and carrying the metallic tang of the energy discharges. He struck at the shadows, his bronze khopesh slicing through the light, until he found the physical form of the man who had killed his son. The air was hot and dry, making every breath a struggle as the apple pulsed with a desperate, final rhythm. Bayek delivered the final blow, his hidden blade cutting through the Romans' fine linen robes and into the heart of the order's leader. As Flavius died, the energy of the apple dissipated in a sudden, violent wave that knocked Bayek to the ground. The air in the Acropolis returned to a sudden, ringing silence, smelling of the spent ozone and the old stone. Bayek stood over the body of the lion, but he felt no surge of joy. The air around him was hollow and cold. He had achieved the vengeance he had sought since Siwa, yet the world remained broken. He looked at the apple, which now sat dull and silent on the marble floor, the air in the room feeling heavy with the secrets it still held. He realized that the death of one man would not stop the order, for their reach was as vast as the air of the empire itself. Aya arrived in Cyrene just as the sun began to set, the air turning a deep, bruised orange over the water. She found Bayek in the temple, the air between them silent and full of a growing distance. They had both changed. The fire of their shared revenge had burned away the life they once knew, leaving only the cold ash of their duty. Aya spoke of the need to take the fight to Rome, where the air was thick with the scent of the Senate and the coming reign of Caesar. She realized that they could no longer be husband and wife in the light of day. The air in the temple was stagnant and smelled of the incense of a dead god. As they made the choice to separate their paths for the good of the world, they traveled back toward the coast, the air of the mountains fresh and smelling of the wild pine. They met with a group of local scholars who had been studying the ancient history of the region. The air in their library was warm and smelled of beeswax and the dry, papery scent of the scrolls. These men and women were the first to pledge themselves to the cause of the hidden ones in Cyrenaica, the air in the room vibrating with the quiet energy of their commitment. Bayek felt a sense of purpose returning, the air in his chest feeling clear as he he began to organize the network that would watch over the western provinces. He was the Medjay of a new kind of world, one that existed in the spaces between the lines of history. As the night ended, the twins stood on the cliffs of Apollonia, the air wild with the wind from the sea. They watched the Roman ships on the horizon, the air carrying the distant sound of the sailors' songs. They exchanged a final look, the air between them a thick, heavy silence. Aya would take the apple to a place where its power could be studied and guarded, while Bayek would return to the shadows of Egypt to ensure the order never regained its grip on the Nile. The air of the Mediterranean was full of the salt and the promise of a long, hidden war. They were the architects of the shadows, and the world was their blueprint. The morning brought a sharp, cold sun that glittered on the waves. The air was crisp and smelled of the sea spray. Bayek watched as Aya's ship disappeared into the mist, the air in his lungs feeling like a cold, steady flame. He was alone, but he was not forgotten. The eagle Senu circled above, the air under her wings, a constant, rhythmic reminder of his connection to the land. He turned his back on the sea and began the long trek toward the desert, the air of the hills carrying the scent of the dry grass and the ancient stone. He was ready for whatever the heart of Egypt would throw at him next. The journey toward the southern frontiers was a move into the desert's deepest secrets. The air there would be the hottest of all, smelling of the baking limestone and the ancient breath of the hidden valleys. Bayek knew that the order was still searching for the lost temples of the gods, and that the air of the desert was full of their agents. He checked his gear, the metal clicking in the silence of the path. He was the hidden one, the catalyst of a change that would breathe a new life into the old world. He was ready to take the fight to the very edges of the map, the shadow of the eagle following him as he moved into the heart of the sun. The night ended with Bayek camping in a hidden cave, the air inside cool and smelling of the dry sand. He sharpened his blade, the metal making a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet. He thought of the path he had traveled from the oasis of Siwa to the halls of Cyrene. The air was peaceful, and the stars were bright over the dunes. He was the protector of the people, the one who worked in the dark to serve the light. The air of the desert was his home, and the secrets of the ancients were his burden. He closed his eyes, the air in the cave still and expectant, as he prepared for the battles that were yet to come. The air in the Fayum was a thick, humid blanket that smelled of the dark mud of the Nile, the sweet rot of the lotus flowers, and the heavy, musky scent of the crocodiles that lined the riverbanks. Bayek returned to the oasis to find a new shadow stretching over the land. The local temples of Sobek, once places of worship for the strength of the river, had been infiltrated by a militant cult that used the sacred animals to terrorize the farmers. The air in the streets of Crocodilopolis was filled with a sense of dread, smelling of the scorched incense from the altars and the iron scent of the blood from the frequent sacrifices. Bayek moved through the reed beds, the air around him vibrating with the low, rhythmic grunts of the reptiles, and the distant, frantic shouting of the overseers. His investigation led him to the temple of Sobek, where the air was stagnant and smelled of the raw meat fed to the sacred crocodiles, and the chemical tang of the cleaning oils used on the stone floors. He learned that the cult was being led by a man known as the Son of Sobek, a fanatic who believed that the order of the ancients had failed because they were not brutal enough. The air in the temple courtyard was hot and dry, making the dust motes dance in the harsh sun. Bayek watched from the shadows of a giant crocodile statue as the cultists forced the villagers to hand over their harvest as an offering to the river god. The air was thick with the scent of the burning grain, a sound that made Bayek's grip on his bow tighten. Bayek's first strike was against the cult's primary distribution hub, a series of granaries near the edge of the lake. The air in the storehouses was cool and smelled of dry wheat and the old wood of the crates. He moved with a silent, focused efficiency, his movements barely stirring the air as he neutralized the guards. He discovered that the cult was using the grain to fund the purchase of Roman weapons. The air in the back rooms smelling of the oiled steel of the gladius and the leather of the military sandals. Bayek burned the records of the debt the villagers owed, the air in the granary filling with the scent of the charred papyrus. He felt a sense of justice returning to the oasis, the air in his chest feeling like a cool, steady breeze. The hunt for the Son of Sobek led Bayek to a hidden sanctuary deep within the marshlands, where the air was a suffocating soup of moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation. He moved through the chest-high water, the air whistling through the tall papyrus reeds. He saw the way the cult had trained the larger crocodiles to attack anyone who approached without the proper incense. The air around the sanctuary was filled with the scent of the bitter herbs used to calm the beasts, a sharp contrast to the earthy smell of the mud. Bayek used his knowledge of the animals to bypass the perimeter. The air in the marsh, silent, except for the rhythmic splashing of the water against his legs. The confrontation inside the sanctuary was a struggle of strength and survival. The Son of Sobek fought with a massive, bronze-headed mace, the air whistling as he swung the weapon with a desperate, practiced speed. The air in the small stone chamber was hot and smelled of the sweat of the combatants and the musky scent of the crocodiles that circled the platform in the center of the room. Bayek used the close quarters to his advantage, his movements a fluid response to the man's heavy strikes. He delivered a final strike with his kopish, the air of the chamber suddenly quiet. As the cult leader died, he spoke of the river taking back what was hers, his voice a fatting rasp in the humidity of the marsh. As the cult began to fracture, Bayek worked with a group of local fishermen to restore the natural balance of the lake. The air in the fishing villages was fresh and smelled of the lake water and the smoke from the morning fires. He spent his days clearing the remaining traps set by the cult, the air around the boats filling with the rhythmic sound of the oars and the splashing of the nets. He felt a sense of connection to the people once more. The air in the oasis finally feeling clear after the oppressive atmosphere of the temple. He realized that the legacy of the hidden ones was not just about the deaths of the powerful, but about the lives of the humble. He met with a young scribe who had been recording the events in the Fayum. The air between them filled with a quiet, respectful understanding. The scribe told Bayek that the people were starting to call him the Shadow of the Nile, a name that made the air feel a little heavier with the weight of the responsibility he carried. Bayek gave the man a small eagle pendant, the metal clicking in the silence of the room. He knew that the story of the hidden ones had to be preserved, not as a legend of gods, but as a history of men and women who chose to fight for the light. The air was full of the smell of the ink and the dry papyrus, a constant reminder of the permanence of the word. As the night ended, Bayek stood on the shore of Lake Moeris, the air cold and carrying the scent of the damp reeds. He watched the stars reflect in the still water, the air between the desert and the lake, a silent, vibrating force. He knew that his work in the Fayum was a chapter in a much larger story. The air of Egypt was still and expectant, as if the land itself was waiting for the next move of the Medjay. He checked his hidden blade, the air in the night still and focused. He was ready for whatever the heart of the country would throw at him next. His eyes fixed on the horizon, where the ancient city of Thebes waited in the haze. The journey toward the southern frontiers was a move into the desert's deepest secrets. The air there would be the hottest of all, smelling of the baking limestone and the ancient breath of the hidden valleys. Bayek knew that the order was still searching for the lost temples of the gods, and that the air of the desert was full of their agents. He checked his gear, the metal clicking in the silence of the path. He was the hidden one, the catalyst of a change that would breathe a new life into the old world. He was ready to take the fight to the very edges of the map, the shadow of the eagle following him as he moved into the heart of the sun. The morning brought a pale, watery sun that struggled to break through the mist of the river. The air was crisp and smelled of the water. Bayek stood on the ridge, watching the oasis wake up once more. He knew that the fight for the Fayum was a turning point. The air was full of the sound of the birds in the reeds, a heartbeat that he was slowly learning to protect. He checked his hidden blade, the air in the small camp still and focused. He was ready for whatever the next horizon would bring. The air in Thebes was dry and carried the ancient, dusty scent of sun-bleached limestone mixed with the faint, sweet aroma of the blue lotus flowers that grew along the riverbanks. As Bayek entered the city, the atmosphere felt heavy and electric, as if a great weight were pressing down on the temples of Karnak and Luxor. Rumors had reached him in the north of a curse that had descended upon the ancient capital, with the ghosts of pharaohs long dead rising to strike down the living. The air in the streets was filled with the frantic whispers of the fearful, and the smell of the city was one of stale incense. and the scorched scent of protective amulets being burned in every doorway. Bayek moved through the massive stone columns, the air around him vibrating with the low, rhythmic chanting of the desperate priests. His investigation led him to the Valley of the Kings, where the air was cold and stagnant, smelling of the dry earth and the absolute silence of the tombs. He found the entrance to a newly uncovered burial chamber, the air inside thick with the scent of old linen and the metallic tang of the precursor artifacts that had been disturbed. He realized that the curse was not the work of gods, but of a group of tomb robbers who had unwittingly activated a piece of ancient technology. The air in the chamber felt pressurized, and as Bayek moved deeper, he saw a flickering, golden light that made the shadows of the painted gods on the walls dance with a life of their own. Bayek's first confrontation with the curse occurred in the heart of the valley, under a moonless sky. The air was suddenly split by a flash of amber light, and the spectral figure of a pharaoh appeared, its voice a hollow, metallic roar that chilled the blood. The air around the apparition was a chaotic swirl of energy that distorted the very space of the desert. Bayek had to trust his instincts, the air whistling as he dodged the ghostly strikes of a khopesh that seemed made of solid light. He realized the figure was a projection, a hard light construct generated by a device hidden in the sand. He used his bow to disable the glowing mechanism, and the air returned to a sudden, ringing silence, smelling of spent ozone and the cold desert night. The hunt for the master of the tomb robbers led Bayek back to the city of Thebes, specifically to the sprawling complex of the Temple of Karnak. The air in the temple was thick with the scent of the heavy tallow candles, and the dry, papery smell of the scrolls stored in the archives. He learned that a high priest, corrupted by the promise of the ancient power, was using the curse to drive the people away so he could claim the precursor treasures for himself. The air in the courtyard was hot, making every breath a struggle against the static charge that seemed to linger in the stone. Bayek moved through the shadows of the obelisks, his movements barely stirring the air as he tracked the priest to the inner sanctum. The confrontation inside the sanctum was a struggle against both man and machine. The priest had integrated a precursor orb into his staff, and the air in the room was a blur of golden energy discharges. Bayek fought with a focused fury, the air ringing as his bronze shield deflected the beams of light. The smell of the room was a sharp mixture of the ozone from the device and the sweet jasmine of the temple offerings. He delivered a final, decisive strike, his hidden blade cutting through the priest's linen robes. As the man died, the golden light faded, and the air in the sanctum returned to its natural, steady warmth. Bayek secured the orb, the air in his chest finally feeling clear as the curse was lifted. While the city of Thebes began to find its peace once more, Bayek worked with a group of local scholars to seal the disturbed tombs in the valley. The air in the scholars' workshop was warm and smelled of beeswax, fresh papyrus, and the dry scent of the charcoal used for sketching. He realized that the knowledge of the ancients was a burden that few could carry without being consumed. He spent his nights in the silence of the desert, the air around him calm, and carrying the scent of the wild desert herbs. He felt a sense of completion, the air in the valley finally returning to the quiet respect it deserved. He met with a woman who had lost her husband to the initial spectral attacks, the air between them filled with a quiet, shared understanding. She thanked him for restoring the dignity of the dead, her voice a steady note in the evening air. Bayek gave her a small token of protection, the metal clicking in the silence. He knew that his role as the hidden one was to stand between the people and the forces they could not understand. The air was full of the smell of the evening cooking fires and the distant, rhythmic splashing of the Nile, a constant reminder of the life that continued to flow. As the night ended, Bayek stood on the ridge overlooking the Valley of the Kings, the air cold and carrying the salt of the distant sea. He watched the stars reflect in the still water of the river, the air between the desert and the green valley, a silent, vibrating force. He knew that his work in Thebes was a significant step in the growth of the Brotherhood. The air of Egypt was still and expectant, as if the land itself was grateful for the silence. He checked his hidden blade, the air in the night still and focused. He was ready for whatever the heart of the country would throw at him next, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the hidden oases of the west waited. The morning brought a pale, watery sun that struggled to break through the mist of the river. The air was crisp and smelled of the water. Bayek stood on the platform of a small boat, watching the temples fade into the haze as he began his journey back toward the desert. He knew that the fight for Egypt was a story without a final end, but a series of beginnings. The air was full of the sound of the birds in the reeds, a heartbeat that he was committed to protecting. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the dust of the ancients and the hope of the new world. The journey toward the western frontiers was a move into the desert's deepest secrets once more. The air there would be the hottest of all, smelling of the baking limestone and the ancient breath of the hidden valleys. Bayek knew that the Order was still searching for the lost temples of the gods in the sands of the Siwa region. He checked his gear, the metal clicking in the silence of the path. He was the hidden one, the catalyst of a change that would breathe a new life into the old world. He was ready to take the fight back to the beginning, the shadow of the eagle following him as he moved into the heart of the sun. The air in Siwa was different now, carrying a sense of weary closure that smelled of the same dry heat, sun-baked limestone, and the sweet, familiar scent of the date palms that had greeted Bayek's youth. Returning to the oasis felt like stepping back into a memory that had been scrubbed raw by the desert wind. The town was quieter, the air no longer vibrating with the immediate terror of Medjanamon's rule. But the silence was heavy, with the weight of the secrets still buried beneath the sand. Bayek moved toward the temple of Amun, the air around him still and expectant, as if the very stones were waiting for the Medjay to finish what had begun in the blood of his son. His investigation led him back to the great vault beneath the temple, the place where the order of the ancients had first shattered his world. The air in the deep stone passages was cold and stagnant, smelling of the dry earth and the metallic tang of the precursor machines that had been silent for a year. He used a torch to light his way, the flame flickering in the thin air of the underground. He found that the vault was more than just a treasury. It was a map room of the ancient world. The air in the central chamber began to hum with a low blue energy as he approached the altar, a sound that made the dust on the floor swirl in rhythmic patterns. Bayek discovered a hidden mechanism that required the glowing sphere he had recovered from the lion. As he placed the artifact into the stone recess, the air in the chamber was suddenly filled with a brilliant golden light that smelled of ozone and ancient static. A holographic map of the world projected itself into the air, showing dozens of points of light scattered across the continents. The air in the room felt pressurized, and Bayek realized that the order was not just after the treasures of Egypt, but a global network of precursor sites. The air was full of the sound of 1,000 whispering voices, a data stream from the past that spoke of a civilization that had fallen long before the first pharaoh was born. The discovery was interrupted by a final group of order acolytes who had been hiding in the upper reaches of the temple. The air in the vault was suddenly split by the sound of their heavy boots and the sharp, metallic clack of their bronze shields. Bayek fought with a cold, precise anger, the air ringing as his blade deflected their strikes in the golden light of the projection. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had become one with the shadows, the air whistling as he neutralized the attackers. He realized that the vault could not be allowed to remain open, for its secrets were a poison that would draw every tyrant in the world to the oasis. Bayek worked to reverse the mechanism, the air in the chamber screaming as the energy was forced back into the stone. He felt the heat of the artifact against his skin, the air smelling of the scorched ozone and the dry limestone dust. With a final, heavy thud, the vault doors ground shut, sealing the map away from the world once more. The air in the temple returned to a sudden, ringing silence, the only light coming from the dying embers of his torch. Bayek stood in the dark, the air in his chest finally feeling light. He had not just avenged his son, he had protected the future by burying the past. He emerged into the Siwa night, the air cold and carrying the scent of the desert lilies. He sat by the spring of Cleopatra, the air filled with the rhythmic splashing of the water against the rocks. He thought of Aya and the work she was doing in Rome, the air of the two cities connected by the invisible thread of their shared creed. He knew that his time as a father and a husband was over, and that his life now belonged to the shadows. The air of the oasis felt peaceful, a soft breeze carrying the promise of a rest that he had earned through fire and blood. He met with the elders of the village the next morning, the air in the meeting circle warm and smelling of the morning tea and the smoke from the communal fire. He told them that the temple was safe and that the shadows of the past were truly gone. The air in the village felt lighter, the heavy scent of fear replaced by the fresh smell of the morning wind. Bayek gave his medjay badge to the village leader, a symbolic gesture that he was moving beyond his old life. He was no longer a protector of a single place, but a guardian of the world's freedom. As the sun began to rise over the dunes, the air turning a pale, shimmering gold, Bayek prepared for his final departure from Siwa. He looked at the ridge where he had once stood with Kemu, the air there still and full of the memory of his son's laughter. He felt a sense of peace that was as solid as the limestone, the air in his lungs clear and steady. He called Senu to his arm, the eagle's weight a familiar, grounding presence. They were the hidden ones, and the world was their watch. The journey away from the oasis was a move into the eternal desert. The air during the day, a shimmering heat that made the horizon look like a ribbon of water. Bayek traveled toward the coast, the air at night cold, and carrying the scent of the dry shrubs and the ancient stone of the tombs. He was the catalyst of a change that would breathe a new life into the world, a spirit that moved in the dark to serve the light. The air of Egypt was his home, and the secrets of the ancients were his burden. But he carried them with a strength that had been forged in the heart of the sun. The morning brought a sharp, cold wind that cleared the haze from the horizon. Bayek stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea, watching the ships on the distant water. He knew that the story of his life was now part of a larger history, a narrative that would be whispered in the shadows for centuries to come. The air was full of the sound of the gulls and the rhythmic crashing of the waves, a constant reminder of the life that continued to flow. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt of the sea and the hope of the new world, and stepped into the silence. The year was 38 BCE, and the air in the Sinai Peninsula was a harsh, dry heat that smelled of red granite dust, salt from the Red Sea, and the acrid smoke of Roman forge fires. Bayek had traveled to this rugged land to support a new cell of the hidden ones who were struggling against a brutal Roman occupation. The air in the Sinai felt sharp and heavy with the scent of iron, as the Romans were stripping the mountains of their turquoise and copper. A new threat had emerged in the form of General Rufio, a man whose discipline was as cold as the mountain stone, and whose reach was enforced by 3 lieutenants who ruled the region with a bloody hand. Bayek's arrival at the hidden camp in the mountains was a quiet affair, the air there smelling of roasted goat, mountain herbs, and the dry scent of the limestone caves. He met with Gamilat, the leader of the local rebels, whose spirit was as fierce as a desert storm. The air in the camp was thick with the sound of sharpening blades and the low, rhythmic chanting of men preparing for war. Gamilat spoke of the massacres Rufio had ordered to break the will of the people. the air in the cave turning cold at the mention of the atrocities. Bayek realized that the hidden ones in Sinai needed more than just a warrior. They needed a symbol of hope that could move through the shadows. The hunt for Rufio's lieutenants led Bayek to the massive quarry of Clysma, where the air was a suffocating cloud of stone dust and the smell of the sweat of 1,000 slaves. He moved through the scaffolding like a mountain lion, the air barely stirred by his presence. He targeted the lieutenant, known as the Mason, a man who viewed human life as nothing more than raw material for his monuments. The air in the Mason's overseer tower was stagnant and smelled of old wine, and the dry, papery scent of the architectural plans. Bayek struck from the rafters, his hidden blade ending the man's cruelty in a sudden, silent motion. As the Mason died, the air in the tower seemed to settle, the heavy pressure of his rule lifting from the quarry below. While Bayek dismantled the Roman infrastructure, he witnessed the cost of Gamelat's aggressive tactics. To draw the Romans into the open, Gamelat had allowed a village to be burned, the air filling with the terrifying scent of charred wood and the copper smell of fresh blood. Bayek found himself in a conflict of ideals, the air between him and Gamelat turning sharp and cold. He realized that the hidden ones could not become the monsters they fought. The air of the Sinai was being poisoned by a different kind of darkness, one that believed the end justified any means. Bayek spent the night in the silence of the high peaks, the air in his lungs feeling heavy with the responsibility of steering the Brotherhood back toward the light. The confrontation with General Rufio took place at the seafort of Arsinoe, where the air was wild with the salt spray, and the smell of the pitch used to seal the Roman galleys. Rufio was a man of the old Roman school, and the air around him was thick with the scent of polished bronze and the smoke of the altar fires. Bayek infiltrated the fort during a heavy Mediterranean storm, the air screaming with the wind and the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the stone ramparts. He found Rufio on the command deck of his flagship, the air there smelling of the rain and the ozone of the lightning. The fight was a clash of iron and bronze, the air ringing with the sound of their blades against the backdrop of the roaring sea. Rufio fought with a heavy tower shield and a short sword, his movements precise and cold. The air on the deck was slick with the rain, making every step a gamble. Bayek used the momentum of the storm to bypass the general's defense, his hidden blade finding the gap in the Romans' armor. As Rufio died, he spoke of the order that Rome brought to the chaos of the world, his voice a fatting rasp against the sound of the thunder. Bayek stood over him, the air around him fresh and cold from the rain. He had removed the head of the Roman occupation, but he knew that the true battle for the soul of the Sinai was still to be fought with his own ally, Gamelat. Bayek returned to the mountain camp to find Gamelat preparing for a final suicidal charge against the remaining Roman legions. The air in the camp was electric with a dangerous, frantic energy. Bayek confronted the rebel leader, the air between them a thick, heavy silence. He showed Gamelat the consequences of his actions, the families destroyed, and the villages lost in the pursuit of a hollow victory. The air in the cave felt thin as the truth settled in. They fought not with blades, but with words and the weight of their shared cause. Eventually, Gamelat understood that the Hidden Ones had to protect the people, not use them as shields. The air in the camp grew quiet and respectful as a new, more measured strategy was formed. As the Romans began a tactical withdrawal from the region, Bayek worked to establish a permanent bureau for the Hidden Ones in the Sinai. The air in the new sanctuary was warm and smelled of beeswax, fresh papyrus, and the dry scent of the mountain air. He realized that the Sinai was a bridge between the East and the West, and that the Brotherhood needed to be the guardians of that passage. He spent his final days in the region teaching the local recruits the importance of the 3 tenets of their creed. The air was full of the smell of the desert herbs and the distant, rhythmic thud of the sea, a constant reminder of the vast world they were sworn to protect. The night ended with Bayek sitting on a high ridge overlooking the Red Sea, the air cold and carrying the salt of the water. He watched the stars reflect in the dark waves, the air between the mountains and the sea, a silent, vibrating force. He knew that his work in the Sinai had solidified the philosophy of the Hidden Ones. They were not just rebels, they were the invisible hand that balanced the world. He checked his hidden blade, the air in the night still and focused. He was ready for the next move, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the ancient lands of the East waited in the haze. The morning brought a pale, watery sun that struggled to break through the mist of the mountains. The air was crisp and smelled of the sea spray. Bayek stood on the platform of a small boat, watching the red peaks of the Sinai fade into the distance as he began his journey back toward the heart of Egypt. He knew that the story of the Hidden Ones was expanding, a narrative that would soon cross every border and every sea. The air was full of the sound of the wind through the sails, a heartbeat that he was committed to protecting. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt of the sea and the hope of the expanding Brotherhood. Year was 35 BCE, and the air in the Valley of the Kings was a dry, ancient weight that smelled of sun-scorched limestone, bitter myrrh, and the deep, cold dust of the forgotten tombs. Bayek had returned to this sacred silence because a series of high-profile assassinations had begun to take place without the approval of the Brotherhood. These kills were precise and efficient, but the air around them was thick with a reckless cruelty that threatened to draw the full attention of the Roman legions stationed in Thebes. Rumors spoke of a ghost moving through the necropolis, a shadow that wore the mark of the Hidden One, but followed no creed. The air in the valley felt stagnant and heavy, as if the desert itself were holding its breath in anticipation of a clash between brothers. Bayek's investigation led him to a small, hidden cave near the base of a jagged cliff, the air inside smelling of charcoal, dried meat, and the metallic scent of a sharpening stone. He found a collection of discarded Roman scrolls and a map of the valley marked with the locations of several high-ranking officers. The air in the cave was still, but it carried the faint, lingering scent of a specific incense used only in the Siwa oasis. Bayek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. The rogue agent was someone who knew his history, someone who was using the techniques of the Medjay to settle a personal score. The air outside the cave began to vibrate with the low, rhythmic thud of a Roman search party, their iron armor clanking in the distance. The hunt for the rogue agent led Bayek to the temple of Hatshepsut, where the air was hot and carried the scent of the dry desert grass and the stagnant water of the ancient cisterns. He saw the figure standing on the upper terrace, silhouetted against the blinding white of the limestone. The air around the person felt sharp and focused. As Bayek approached, the figure turned, revealing a face hardened by years of solitary survival. It was a former initiate from the early days of the Memphis Bureau, a man who believed that Bayek had become too soft, too concerned with the lives of the people, and not enough with the total destruction of the order. The air between them turned cold. The sound of the wind through the columns, the only thing filling the silence. The confrontation was a brutal display of the Hidden One's own methods used against each other. The rogue agent used smoke bombs to turn the air into a gray, choking fog that smelled of sulfur and saltpeter. Bayek had to rely on his hearing, the air ringing with the sound of the man's hidden blade as it struck his bronze bracers. They moved through the temple like twin storms, their movements a fluid, deadly dance that barely stirred the dust on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of the smoke and the sweat of the struggle. Bayek eventually managed to pin the man against a stone relief, the air in his lungs burning as he demanded to know why the creed had been abandoned. The man only laughed, his voice a dry rasp in the heat, claiming that the shadows were meant for killing, not for saving. While Bayek dealt with the rogue, the Roman presence in the valley reached a boiling point. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of burning pitch and the roar of 1,000 voices as the legionnaires began to search the tombs for the assassins. Bayek realized that the rogue's actions had endangered every civilian in the nearby village. He had to make a choice: finish his duel or save the innocent. The air of the valley was now a chaotic mixture of smoke, dust, and the iron scent of the coming battle. He turned away from the rogue, the air whistling past him as he dove into the fray to intercept the Roman commander. He knew that the Brotherhood would be judged by the air they left behind, not just the blood they spilled. Bayek's intervention was a frantic series of strikes that focused on disabling the Roman command structure without causing unnecessary death. The air around the commander's tent was thick with the smell of expensive wine and the heavy tallow of the maps. He neutralized the officers, the air in the tent suddenly quiet as the leadership was removed. He then moved to the village, the air there smelling of the fear and the wood smoke of the cooking fires. He guided the families into the hidden passages of the nearby tombs, the air inside cool and protective. He felt the weight of his original purpose returning, the air in his chest feeling light and steady, as he realized that the creed was the only thing that kept them from becoming the very monsters they hunted. He returned to the temple of Hatshepsut to find the rogue agent gone, the only trace of his presence, a discarded eagle feather on the stone floor. The air in the temple was now fresh and carried the scent of the evening breeze. Bayek knew that the hunt was not over, but the immediate threat to the valley had been neutralized. He spent the night in the shadows of the colossi, the air around him still and full of the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the desert. He realized that as the Brotherhood grew, the air would always be full of those who misinterpreted their mission. It was his task to remain the anchor, the one who ensured that the shadow served the light. As the morning sun began to touch the tops of the mountains, the air turning a pale, shimmering gold, Bayek met with a group of new initiates from Thebes. The air in the meeting circle was warm and smelled of the morning bread and the fresh papyrus of their oaths. He told them the story of the rogue agent, the air in the temple courtyard, quiet and respectful. He used the experience to reinforce the importance of the first tenet: stay your blade from the flesh of the innocent. The air was full of the smell of the desert lilies and the distant, rhythmic splashing of the Nile, a constant reminder of the life they were sworn to protect. The night ended with Bayek standing on the ridge overlooking the valley, the air cold and carrying the salt of the distant sea. He watched the stars reflect in the dark water of the river, the air between the desert and the green valley, a silent, vibrating force. He knew that the story of the rogue agent was a warning for the future of the hidden ones. The air of Egypt was still and expectant, as if the land itself was grateful for the balance he had restored. He checked his equipment, the metal clicking in the silence of the night. He was ready for the next move, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the ancient lands of the east waited in the haze. The morning brought a sharp, cold wind that cleared the haze from the horizon once more. Bayek stood on the platform of a small boat, watching the valley fade into the distance. He knew that the fight for the soul of the Brotherhood was a struggle that would never truly end. The air was full of the sound of the wind through the sails, a heartbeat that he was committed to protecting. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt of the sea and the hope of the new world, and prepared to face the next challenge that waited in the shadows. The year was 30 BCE, and the air in Alexandria was a heavy, stagnant heat that smelled of the salt spray from the harbor, the sweet rot of overripe melons, and the acrid smoke of a city under siege. The white marble of the palaces looked like bone against the dark, stormy sky, and the atmosphere was thick with the scent of the coming rain. Bayek had returned to the royal city for a final confrontation with the world he had helped build. Cleopatra had secured her throne, but the air around her was no longer that of a revolutionary queen. It was the cold, suffocating air of a tyrant who had fully embraced the order of the ancients to maintain her power. The streets were filled with the sound of Roman boots and the rhythmic, fearful whispering of the citizens who saw their freedom slipping away into the haze of the new empire. Bayek moved through the royal gardens under a moonless sky, the air there smelling of jasmine, damp earth, and the metallic scent of the hidden blades that lined the hallways. He saw the way the queen's guards moved with a rigid, unnatural discipline, their eyes blank in the flickering torchlight. The air in the palace was stagnant and smelled of expensive frankincense, used to mask the scent of the blood that had been spilled to keep the throne. He found Cleopatra in her private study, the air inside cool and smelling of the dry papyrus and the old wine she favored. She sat surrounded by maps of the world, her breath shallow and her presence a dark weight in the quiet room. The air between them was a thick, vibrating silence that carried the weight of a decade of broken promises. The confrontation was not one of blades, but of words that felt as sharp as steel. Cleopatra spoke of the necessity of order, her voice a low, steady vibration in the still air. She claimed that the people needed a strong hand to guide them through the chaos of the Roman expansion, the air in the room turning cold as she justified her alliance with the very men who had killed Bayek's son. Bayek realized that the woman he had once seen as a hope for Egypt had become the very thing they were sworn to destroy. The air in his lungs felt like lead as he told her that the hidden ones would no longer support her reign. He saw a flicker of the old Cleopatra in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by the cold, glassy look of a monarch who had chosen the crown over her soul. While Bayek stood in the palace, the city outside was being torn apart by the arrival of Octavian's forces. The air in the harbor was a chaotic mixture of burning pitch, the salt of the Mediterranean, and the iron scent of the coming battle. Bayek left the palace, the air whistling past him as he leaped from the marble balconies into the shadows of the lower city. He found the local bureau of the Hidden Ones preparing to go underground, the air in their sanctuary smelling of beeswax, old leather, and the sharp scent of the oil used to clean their weapons. He realized that the era of the pharaohs was truly ending, and the heir of the world was becoming Roman. He gave the order to burn their records, the air in the room filling with the scent of the charred papyrus, as they prepared to vanish into the history they had shaped. The final days of the siege were a blur of fire and shadows. The air in Alexandria was a thick soup of gray soot and the smell of the sea. Bayek watched from the heights of the Pharos lighthouse as the Roman legions took control of the city, the air ringing with the sound of their brass trumpets and the rhythmic crashing of their shields. He saw the smoke rising from the royal quarter, the air smelling of the destruction of the old world. He felt a profound, hollow fatigue, the air in his chest feeling like the dry dust of the desert. He knew that Aya was in the city as well, her presence a silent, cold frequency in the chaos. They were the ghosts of Egypt, watching as their home was transformed into a province of a distant power. Bayek met Aya one last time in the ruins of the temple where they had first planned their revenge. The air there was still and smelled of the old stone and the damp mud of the Nile. They stood in the center of the chamber, the air between them a heavy, peaceful silence. Aya told him that she was going to Rome to ensure that Octavian did not become another tyrant, her voice a steady note in the quiet air. She was no longer the woman he had married in Siwa. She was Amenet, the mother of the Brotherhood. The air in the temple felt balanced, a sense of closure settling over them like the evening mist. They made a final pact to remain hidden, their names forgotten, so that their creed could endure. As the sun set over the ruined harbor, the air turning a deep, bruised orange, Bayek watched Aya's ship sail toward the horizon. The air was full of the salt and the scent of the coming night. He stood on the edge of the water, the rhythmic splashing of the waves a constant, grounding force. He felt a sense of peace that was as solid as the limestone of the pyramids. He had lost his son, his wife, and his country, but he had found a purpose that transcended them all. The air of Egypt was still his home, but it was now a land of secrets and shadows. He checked his hidden blade, the metal clicking in the silence, and prepared to disappear into the heart of the people. He spent his final weeks in the city, helping the common people navigate the new Roman laws, the air in the markets smelling of the fresh bread and the smell of the spices. He was a shadow that brought hope, a silent protector who moved in the spaces between the lines of the empire. The air in the city was slowly clearing of the smoke of the siege, replaced by the crisp, cold air of the new era. He realized that the Brotherhood was like the Nile. It would always find a way to flow, no matter how many stones were placed in its path. The air was full of the sound of the morning bells and the distant, rhythmic thud of the Roman construction, a heartbeat that he was committed to watching. The night ended with Bayek standing on the ridge of the Great Pyramid, the air cold and carrying the scent of the desert lilies. He watched the stars reflect in the dark water of the river, the air between the desert and the green valley, a silent, vibrating force. He knew that the story of his life was now complete, but the story of the hidden ones was just beginning. The air of Egypt was peaceful and expectant, as if the land itself were grateful for the silence. He called Senu to his arm, the eagle's weight a familiar, grounding presence. They were the ghosts of the old world, the guardians of the new. The morning brought a sharp, cold wind that cleared the haze from the horizon. Bayek stood on the platform of a small boat, watching the towers of Alexandria fade into the distance. He was moving south, back toward the silence of the desert where his journey had begun. He knew that the world would never know his name, and that was the greatest victory of all. The air was full of the sound of the wind through the sails, a heartbeat that he was committed to protecting. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the salt of the sea and the hope of the eternal brotherhood, and stepped into the silence. The year was 10 BCE, and the air in the Siwa oasis was a soft, golden warmth that smelled of sun-dried palm fronds, the cool mineral water of the springs, and the sweet, heavy scent of ripening dates. Bayek was an old man now, his skin a roadmap of the scars, and sun lines earned over 40 years of life in the shadows. He sat on the same high ridge where he had once stood with his son, the air around him quiet and still. The oasis had returned to a state of peace, its air free from the immediate smell of blood and iron that had defined the Roman expansion. Bayek moved slowly, the air in his lungs a steady, calm rhythm as he looked out over the land that had birthed the hidden ones. He spent his days teaching the newest generation of initiates in the cool shade of the temple ruins. The air in their training circle was filled with the scent of desert sage and the dry, papery smell of the scrolls that used to record their history. He didn't teach them only how to strike. He taught them how to breathe with the city, how to listen to the air for the whispers of the oppressed, and how to remain invisible in the light of day. He watched as they practiced with their wooden blades, the air ringing with the soft, hollow thuds of their training. He saw the same fire in their eyes that had once burned in his own, and the air felt light with the promise of a future that would not be forgotten. The air in Bayek's small house was always cool and smelled of the cedar chest where he kept his old Medjay shield and his first hidden blade. He often spent the evenings writing letters to Aminet in Rome, the air in the room filled with the scratch of his reed pen, and the scent of the beeswax used to seal the messages. They were no longer the parents of a lost boy. They were the architects of a silent world that now stretched from the Nile to the Tiber. The air between their letters was full of a deep, quiet respect and a love that had survived the death of their old selves. He knew that she was the soul of the Brotherhood, and he was its heart, beating steadily in the heat of the Egyptian sun. A final message arrived from the north, carried by an eagle that landed on his balcony as the sun set. The air of the message smelled of the salt from the great sea and the heavy incense of the Roman temples. Aminet wrote that the influence of the order had been pushed back into the deepest corners of the empire, and that the air of Rome was finally clear of the immediate threat of a single tyrant. Bayek felt a surge of peace, the air in his chest feeling like the cool breeze that moved through the palms at night. He realized that the work they had started in the blood of the Siwa crypt had become a shield for all of humanity. He made one last trip into the vault beneath the Temple of Amun, the air inside still and smelling of the ancient stone and the cold dust of the centuries. He didn't go to seek power, but to leave a legacy. He placed a small stone cylinder into a hidden niche, a record of the true events of his life and the founding of the creed. The air in the vault vibrated with a faint blue light as the doors ground shut for the final time. He knew that the world would eventually forget the name Bayek of Siwa, and he was content. The air of the vault was a silent tomb for his secrets, a place where they would wait for a time when the world needed them again. As his strength began to fade, he returned to the high ridge to watch the stars one last time. The air was cold and carried the scent of the desert lilies and the dry grass. He felt the presence of Senu on his shoulder, the eagle's breath a soft, rhythmic warmth against his neck. The air was full of the sound of the wind through the dunes, a constant, eternal song that spoke of the rise and fall of empires. He closed his eyes, the air in his lungs becoming part of the desert breeze. He was no longer a man of flesh and bone. He was the shadow that protected the light, a spirit that would move through the air of Egypt forever. The final scene took place centuries later, when the air of Egypt was filled with the sound of modern machines and the scent of gasoline. A young scholar found a small, sun-bleached eagle skull buried in the sand near the Siwa ruins. The air around the artifact seemed to hum with a faint, ancient energy, a remnant of the man who had first carried it. The scholar felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of peace, the air in the desert feeling fresh and full of a hidden history. The legacy of Bayek and Amenet was not in the monuments of stone, but in the very air that people breathed, a constant, invisible reminder that freedom was a gift that had to be earned in the dark. The air in the oasis remained a soft, warm embrace, smelling of the dates and the water. The story of the origins was complete, but the creed continued to flow like the Nile, always changing and always the same. The shadows were a place of safety, and the light was a place of service. The Medjay had found his rest, but his watch would never truly end. The air was still, the stars were bright, and the world was dreaming of a peace that had been won by a father's love and a protector's blade.